Hello, everyone. Welcome to my channel. Thanks for tuning in. And today, uh, just like every day, this is an educational channel. And we check out great theories and concepts and discoveries that you might not know anything about because they've been suppressed from the general um, channels of observation. And you have to do some digging to get there in more ways than one. Uh, And this is, I believe, number 438 of the Bible Decode series. And these are things that your priest, pastor, pope, rabbi, imam don't want you to know anything about. I guess maybe your imam maybe doesn't care. But this is so far been focused on the New Testament. And we have tried to examine um, everything we can about the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament, which I would consider to be the Roman origins certainty for the New Testament, um, pending the Roman origins law for the New Testament. And that is that the Romans are the true authors of the New Testament. The Caesars, particularly of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, who ruled uh, the Roman Empire from 69 until 96 AD. They wrote the New Testament as a psychological operation against the Jews. Maybe that sounds familiar. Um, Probably know by now that the 20th and 21st century are filled with psychological operations. What you might not know is that as you go back through time, you will find just as many psychological operations in the ancient times as now. And the Romans were masters of psychological warfare and propaganda. They created a bunch of religions in the first century, including a couple of other strains that were intended for the Jews. But these are really targeted toward the Messianic Jews, um, the Jews from the Old Testament books have, believed in a Jewish Messiah who was going to rise up and deliver the Jews from their oppressors by military force. And in this case, that was the Romans. The Romans occupied Judea starting in 63 BC. And so for over a century, the Jews were uprising, revolting, and um, there was an outright war starting in 66 AD, a revolt that was um, led by a number of self proclaimed Jewish messiahs. And it took the Romans literally 7 years to put down the revolt. And the two primary generals for the Romans in that war eventually became the Flavian emperors, Titus and his father Vespasian. And these are the people that instituted the Gospels as a psychological operation. They made up a fictional story about Jesus, a Jewish Messiah who was not a military commander uh, to try to deliver the Jews from the Romans, from the Roman oppression, but instead was a Jewish Messiah who was entirely deferential to the Romans, a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking the extra mile with the Roman soldier's heavy backpack and turning the other cheek to oppression. And at the same time, being utterly uh, critical of the Jews, overturning the tables of the Jewish money changers at the outskirts of the temple and castigating the Jews for selling small animals at the temple, telling his Jewish disciples that they needed to abandon their families in order to follow him, and calling the Pharisees a generation of vipers, among other things. Not once in the Gospels did Jesus do anything against the Romans. And Paul is even worse than Jesus as far as that goes. Very critical of the Jews and totally deferential to the Romans. Uh, Almost as if the Romans had created the whole story themselves. And the fact that the story is written in Greek doesn't help matters. It should be a red flag for you right off the bat. The followers of Jesus in Palestine were Aramaic speakers. Very few of them knew how to read and write at all, much less in Greek. And um, but the evidence then becomes direct when you take a look at the writings of Josephus, the Jewish uh, historian who defected from the Jews to become one of the Romans and was adopted by the Flavians, um, given a position as one of the court historians by the Flavians, and uh, given a townhouse to live at Rome, and having his work, a 7-volume history called War of the Jews, which is a chronicle of this war that we're discussing from 66 to 73 AD, um, given acclaim by the Caesars for this work that basically glorified them, and um, was actually adopted by the Flavian family, and he is known as Flavius Josephus. And if you take a look at Josephus's work, the parallels between Josephus and the New Testament jump off the page, particularly if you're looking at the book of Luke. And there's a sequence in those two books that about 40 separate events in the same order in both books, between the military campaign of General Titus, soon to become Emperor Titus, and the ministry of Jesus. The ministry of Jesus is patterned off the military campaign of Titus. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus goes in the same order, and at every location, they experience parallel events. Generally, Titus experiences the events literally, while Jesus experiences the events symbolically. And each event is set off by a gap of 40 years, because the Flavians wrote the Gospels in the 70s, 80s, and 90s AD, but they set the story in the 30s, early 30s AD. And so the events of General Titus occurred between 70 and 73 AD. And so the events of Jesus occur between 30 and 33 AD. And that is just one of a bunch of different parallels. There are several different themes. Many of them are mean-spirited and mocking and demeaning of the Jews. There's literally hatred dripping off the page in some places of the Jews, once you kind of decode what's going on. Um, in particular, the Romans love to make fun of the Jews for their cannibalism, which apparently occurred uh, at least at some point during the siege of Jerusalem, when the Romans surrounded the city and the Jews couldn't get out, and so they couldn't get any food, and some of them were accused of eating each other. And there's a story in Josephus about a woman named Mary who eats her son, her infant son, and she only eats half of him and saves the other half. When the Romans then uh, invade her dwelling, she offers uh, the other half of her son to the Romans to eat, and they are aghast. But she calls the other half of the son of Mary is called the good portion, which is exactly the same phrase that is used um, in the story of Lazarus. When Lazarus is resurrected, so called, from his grave in by Jesus. But that is not a resurrection. Actually, Jesus takes Lazarus out of the ground dead. Um, and they take Lazarus home and they make him a supper, meaning that they cook him and eat him. And Jesus says the same thing to Martha when Martha criticizes Mary for uh, anointing Jesus instead of helping her in the kitchen with the supper of Lazarus. And um, Jesus says that Mary has saved the good portion, and so on. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of other parallels. In fact, Michael Menescat's found over 250 parallels between between the book of Luke, just the book of Luke, and the work of Josephus. And then he graphed them on a chart and found that they actually spell five perfect letters in Latin, the emerging language of the Roman government. Anyway, check out the work of Josephus. You can get him on PDF for free and compare him with your Gospels. You don't have to believe me. Anyway, when the Romans wrote the New Testament, they used all kinds of other sources because they wanted to make it look like a real religion. So they put in a lot of uplifting and, edifying material that they found from other religions and belief systems and philosophies and mythologies from Egypt and India and China and Japan and Persia and the pagans, Greek and Roman, and also Jewish Old Testament books. And that is documented here by Kersey Graves in his book called 16 Crucified Saviors Before Christ. It shows how all the work in the New Testament is not original, not unique, but derivative of much earlier stories. Um, and right now, we're in chapter 40 of this book. Now, keep in mind, this book is very old. It's from 1876. And so um, you have to consider that the person is living in that time period. This section is called Christ as a Man and Christ as a Sectarian. To every observant and unbiased mind, a strange contrast must be visible in the practical life of Jesus when viewed in his twofold capacity as of a man and a priest, while standing upon the broad plane of humanity, with his deep sympathetic nature directed toward the poor, the unfortunate, and the downtrodden. There often gushed forth from his impassioned bosom the most sublime expressions of pity and the strongest outburst of commiseration for wrongs and sufferings. And his noble goodness and tender love yearned with a throbbing heart to relieve them. But the moment he put on the sacerdotal robe, and assumed the character of a priest. That moment, if anyone crossed his path by refusing to yield to his requisitions of faith or dissented from his religious creed, his whole nature was seemingly changed. It was no longer, "Blessed are ye," but, "Cursed are ye," or "Woe unto you." Like the founders of other religious systems, he was ardent toward friends and bitter toward enemies, and extolled his own religion while he denounced all others. His way was the only way, and all who did not walk therein or conform thereto were loaded with curses and imprecations, and all who could not accomplish the impossible mental achievement of believing everything he set forth or urged upon their credence, and that, too, without evidence, were to be eternally damned. All who climbed up any other way were thieves and robbers. All who professed faith in any other religion than his were on the road to hell. Like the Oriental gods, he taught that the world was to be saved through faith in him and his religion. All who did not honor him were to be dishonored by the Father. And without faith in him and his religion, it is impossible to please God. He declared that all who were not for him were against him, and all who were not on the same road are heathens and publicans. His disciples were enjoined to shake off the dust from their feet as a manifestation of displeasure toward those who could not conscientiously subscribe to their creeds and dogmas. Thus, we discover a strong vein of intolerance and sectarianism in the religion of the otherwise, and in other respects, the kind and loving Jesus. Though most benignantly kind and affectionate, while moving and acting under the controlling impulses of his lofty manhood, yet when his ardent religious feelings were touched, he became chafed, irritated, and sometimes intolerant. He then could tolerate no such thing as liberty of conscience, or freedom of thought, or the right to differ with him in religious belief. His extremely ardent devotional nature, when roused into action in defense of a stereotyped faith, eclipsed his more noble, lofty, and lovely traits, and often dimmed his mental vision, thus presenting in the same individual a strange medley and a strange contrast of the most opposite traits of character. That such a being should have been considered and worshipped as a god, and for the very reason that he possessed such strange, contradictory traits of character, and often let his religion run riot with his reason, will be looked upon by posterity as one of the strangest chapters in the history of the human race. But so it is. Extraordinary good qualities, though intermingled with many errors and human foibles, have deified many men. And I would agree with that wholeheartedly. But I would add, or maybe disagree a little bit, because these are the same characteristics of Yahweh Elohim in the Old Testament of the Bible. You know, Yahweh has a strain where he's kind of nice, and he seems to be looking after his people. his chosen people. But he can turn on a dime on you and, zap you, um, and strike you dead arbitrarily. And he can, so this kind of split personality is kind of what I'm looking at in terms of both Yahweh and Jesus. They both kind of um, elicit that. Now, when Yahweh does it, he'll strike you dead. Jesus will just insult you and get angry at you. Um, so I guess Jesus is a major improvement over Yahweh Elohim. Neither of them are gods, quite obviously, um, and Jesus never existed. Yahweh Elohim at least existed, but he just wasn't God. He was some giant that was technologically advanced and probably pretty smart, um, but had every personality disorder in the book, but especially anger management issues and obsessive compulsive disorders, zealousness and jealousness, arbitrary and capriciousness, and insecurity. Um, okay, now there is a note here. I believe this is the end of the chapter. One Christian writer alleges in defense of the objectionable precepts of Jesus Christ that he taught some errors in condescension to the ignorance of the people, blaming the people instead of Jesus, as is normal for Christians, giving Jesus a free pass all the time and ignoring all of the stuff right there in black and white that they should be able to notice that Jesus is not far from anything perfect, even in a fictional story. But it says, if this be true, that he taught both truth and falsehood, then the question arises, how can we know which is which? By what rule can we discriminate them, as he himself furnishes none? Or how are we to determine that he taught truth at all? And then this plea would account for and excuse all the errors found in the teachings of the Oriental gods. If it will apply in one case, it will in the other, and thus it proves too much. And indeed, if you were to read the story of Jesus, but Jesus was called something else, and it was in Indian, a book about India, or about China, or about the Norse, or about the Egyptians, or the Sumerians, you would call it mythology. But since it's about Jesus, you call it fact and truth. Um, and that shows that you're not really being honest with yourself. Okay, now chapter 42 is called Christ as a Spiritual Medium. And I think we're just going to check out the first couple paragraphs here just to get a taste of this, and then we'll come back to this when we return tomorrow. There are many incidents related in the life of Christ, which, when critically examined, furnish abundant evidence that he was what is now known as a spiritual medium. He unquestionably represented and often practically exhibited several important phases of modern mediumship. And he's got here a number of them. I think we're just going to look at number one just to get ourselves going, and then um, give you something to think about for homework. Number one, the many instantaneous cures which he wrought, as reported in his gospel narrative, performed in the same manner that spirit doctors now heal the sick, prove that he was an excellent healing medium. Now, maybe so. Basically, all of these healings that Jesus wrought are um, derivative of pagan stories and also some Jewish stories. Elisha, Elijah, um, they, I believe, did some healing, resurrecting of the dead, and so on and so forth. So, you know, uh, I'm not sure where he's going to go with this mediumship, but the fact remains that these stories that are in the Gospels are copied from much earlier stories, some of them from the Old Testament and some of them from pagan sources. And you can generally find the actual exact story or stories. Sometimes um, they are spliced from two or three different stories, but you can find the antecedents for them and trace them uh, usually pretty easily. That's been done. Um, okay, well, we will stop right there and return tomorrow. Thanks for tuning in today. Like, share, subscribe, and comment, and contribute. And come back tomorrow for another Bible Decode. And otherwise, thanks for tuning in today and have a great day.